Are you new to the aquarium hobby and maybe you wish you had like a really good friend that could give you lots of advice and tips and tricks on the aquarium hobby? Well, today you've got me and you've got Irene, and we're gonna share with you our experience and knowledge on some different beginner tips and also some advanced tips on how to better navigate the aquarium hobby. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick us off with my first tip, and that's to learn about water. All of your aquariums have water in them. All of your inhabitants are living in water. You do wanna understand about nitrate and nitrite and ammonia and how they impact fish, pH levels, hardness levels, but also it's important to understand how you're gonna test and read all of these things. So there are a few ways that you can do that. The best way is to get a very easy test kit. Now I like to use the multi-test strips from Aquariumcoop, and we also have the ammonia test strips. So these are some very easy strips that you can just take, open up, put in an aquarium, and read them in just a few seconds or within a minute. And it's gonna give you some readings that are very easy to understand. And then if you look at the chart that's on the package, and you'll be able to see kind of where you are with your water parameters and if you need to make any adjustments. Now there are other test kits available. There are master test kits, and there are even things like refractometers if you're gonna get into keeping saltwater fish or brackish water fish. But basically you just want an easy way of understanding what's happening in your water and also understand what those readings mean. Now let's kick it over to Irene and hear what her first tip is.
So mine's actually pretty related to yours in that I didn't realize as a beginner there are certain fish that really like certain water parameters. And so one of the ways I found to be more successful with new fish I buy is if I get them from a local hobbyist, a local breeder, or even my local fish store, because they tend to have very similar water parameters to mine. And then that way when I bring home the fish, they'll have a greater likelihood of success. Highly recommend that you buy local if at all possible. I know it's really tempting to just go online and click kind of like Amazon, but the local fish market is definitely gonna give you a greater chance of success.
Yeah, that's some really good advice. And I know that every time that I've purchased fish locally, I've had, greater success rates just because knowing that they've been in that water. And even if I gotten them from local breeders where they've been bred in those waters, that's also led to better success. So great advice. My next tip is going to be the back saving tip, and that is to make it as easy as possible to move water. One, you don't want to have to physically carry buckets of water when you're doing water changes and emptying your tank or filling your tank. Also, it's going to help prevent things like spills and you dropping water on the ground and having your significant other or housemates get upset with you because you just dropped a bunch of fish water on the carpet or something like that. So make it as easy as possible to get water out of your aquarium into a drain or into a garden or wherever that water's going, and then also back into the aquarium, whether it's from a tap or some other water source. Now, there are things that you can use like submersible pumps or pythons or other ways. You can use hoses. Think about how you're going to do water changes, and is it going to be easy? Are you putting a fish tank on a second floor of a home and there's no water up there? Maybe consider putting that somewhere down on the first floor closer to a sink or to a drain area so you're not going to be having to carry buckets around.
I totally agree with you, Zenzo. I think when I found out about aquarium siphons with my first betta tank, it was like life-changing. So yes, definitely make sure you figure out your water situation because you're gonna be cleaning some tanks. For me, I think my next tip is kind of piggybacking off what I said about getting new fish. Whenever I bring new fish into my house, even if I got them from a friend, I definitely quarantine them, meaning I set up kind of a separate hospital tank or even a plastic container to hold those fish, those new fish, so I can make sure that they're not sick, they're not, gonna pass on any infectious diseases to the existing tanks I have. For me, I like to quarantine for at least 4 weeks. And so what I'll do is the first week, I will proactively treat them with the quarantine med trio. So we have Maricin is a great broad spectrum antibiotic. Then Paraclins is really good at treating internal parasites. And then ICX is really good for external parasites as well as fungus. So they kind of soak in that bath of medication for the first week. Then the second week, I do a water change. They get kind of a little break. I start feeding them the second week. The third week, I do another water change, and then I just treat Paraclins just to make sure if there are any internal parasites that were just still as eggs and they hadn't hatched yet, that second round of Paraclins is gonna knock them out. And then finally, that fourth week, another water change, still feeding them regularly. If they have no weird symptoms, they're all behaving great and eating well, then that's when I feel comfortable putting them into my main display tanks. Now, I know some of you guys are gonna say, well, but my particular location, I'm not able to get these medications. And in that case, you might consider looking at aquarium salt is a good, again, broad spectrum medication for treating fish. It's not as good at treating internal medications, but at least it's a kind of foothold that will help you get started in having clean, healthy fish in your aquariums. What about you, Zenzo? What's your next tip for beginners?
My next tip is to always use a timer. I'm talking about timers for your aquarium lights. So this will help you in avoiding things like excess algae, which can happen if your aquarium has too much light, which sometimes happens when people leave the lights on too long, which is not bad for the tank, but it is unsightly. So if you have a timer, then you're assured that every time your lights will turn on at the same time of day and they'll turn off at the same time of day. Now there are some very inexpensive timers. You can get things like this little dial timer here that you can pick up at any hardware store. We like to use the Casa Wi-Fi timer. The reason why is it's connected to an app. So I can actually look at my phone and I can see all of my timers, and I can even control my lights from my phone. So not only can I program them to turn on and off at certain times of the day, but I can also manually change them. So if you look behind me, you'll see the lights just went off just because I clicked the button. Then I can turn them right back on. So it is a really, really useful thing to have. And again, it doesn't have to be an expensive timer or anything like that. You can do something as simple as just a dial type, or get something a little bit more sophisticated like the Wi-Fi timer.
Yeah, timers and lighting are really important, especially as I want to get into my tip, which is about live aquarium plants. For my first aquarium, it's probably like a lot of you guys, if you're beginners, my first tank did not have any plants in it. It had a lot of fish in it. And I was finding myself having to do kind of large water changes every single week to keep the nitrate down. However, once I started imitating nature, things got a lot better. So for example, if you look at nature and you have a forest, there typically is a lot of trees and plant life and not a lot of animals, like not a lot of deer, for example. Versus if you flip things around and you had a ton of deer and not a lot of plant life, you're pretty much gonna have a disaster on your hands. In the same way, you want to have an aquarium that has tons of live aquarium plants and then very little fish in comparison. That way, not only are the plants very beautiful to look at, but they also have this amazing ability to consume the toxic nitrogen waste that's produced by your fish, and it helps purify your water, and then you don't have to do as many water changes.
That is excellent advice, and actually, I have actually come to the realization that I don't want to have an aquarium if I'm not able to have plants in there somehow. So even like in even like some of my tanks where I've got African cichlids that might eat certain plants or they're super aggressive, I'll play around and find a plant that will work in that aquarium, or I'll even do some plants that are essentially terrestrial plants or whatever that are above the aquarium, but their root structure is still in the water, absorbing those nitrates, as Irene shared. So great advice. My next tip is to be prepared for the worst. And you could have things like spills, something breaking and having a tank leak. It is important to know that there is going to be a time when you're going to have water underground somewhere and you're not going to want that water. I always have extra towels that are just for fish, and I keep those towels like in the cabinets of my fish tanks. Know that some point in your aquarium keeping career, there's probably going to be some type of power outage in your home that might be for an extended period of time, and you're going to want the ability to have some oxygen going in your aquarium. Now you could use things like a battery powered air pump. You could also have like battery backups, like little power banks where you could plug in some USB air pumps and then run an air stone into your aquarium. Also things like having a generator on hand is also helpful, especially if you have a lot of aquariums or some larger battery backup systems like I have in this room. Another important part when it comes to preparing for the worst is making sure that you have some medication supplies on hand. Just in case, you never know what might pop up and you don't have the ability to go to the store right away and treat for it, there is a possibility that you could lose the fish. So having some medications on hand is helpful. And if you live in a country where medication is not available, then I would recommend always having some aquarium salt on hand. Now, talking about something bad happening, I actually have an emergency sheet that I keep just on the outside of this fish room wall here. And in that envelope, there's instructions on what to do if something were to happen to me. Now, I don't expect my wife or daughter or anyone else that's not a fish person to know how to take care of all these animals in here. So there's very detailed directions in there. You know, if something happens to me and I got in a car accident or whatever the situation is, don't worry about the aquariums. They're okay for X amount of days. Like, you don't need to feed them or worry about them for several days. If something worse happens, here's who to contact to help you with water changes. Here's who to contact if something catastrophic happens and I can no longer have fish, maybe I've passed away or something, then they will know that, hey, I can call this person, they will come and take care of the aquarium and take it out of here for me, because it's a very stressful time, and I wouldn't want, let's say, my wife to be burdened with having to figure out what to do with 30 aquariums. Whether it's 1 aquarium or 30 aquariums, I would still want my loved ones to know what to do in the event that I'm not able to take care of it. So having some kind of contingency plan, it will help them, and it will just be a good peace of mind as far as making sure that everything's okay.
That is really good advice, and so I feel like I learned something today. I'm going to make an emergency letter for my husband too, and I'm going to put your phone number on there so he can call you if something happens to me.
Exactly. So yeah.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah, so it's good to have like friends that are in the aquarium hobby around you, right? So if you have a friend that lives in the same town or something and they're into aquariums, put their contact information on that sheet. So, you know, your husband, your wife, your significant other, they can know, hey, I'm just going to call Bob or Susie and they're going to know what to do, and I'll be okay. So, yeah, that's...
Or the website of your local aquarium society or something.
Exactly.
So somebody can help out.
List them all there.
Well, I'm going to take a complete left turn with my next tip, which is, I'm going to say it right now, sponge filters are my favorite filter. I've owned hang-on back filters, I've owned canister filters, I played with a lot of them, but really I just think in the end of the day, they're the most reliable. I've never had flooding issues with sponge filters, unlike some of the other filters I've used. I never have to worry about my fish running out of oxygen because of the bubbles that are naturally produced. It has gas exchange at the surface, and so I'm, constantly new oxygen is being introduced into the tank. Most of the tanks I keep are also nano tanks that have nano fish in them. They're generally not the fastest swimmers, so having that gentle flow is really good for a betta fish or other, a pea puffer, for example. And then like Zenzo mentioned, there's that great air pump with the battery backup that we have that we sell at Aquariumcoop, and I really love using that because it lasts for 8 hours, automatically turns on even if I'm not in the house and the power goes down, or if I put it in power save mode, it can go up to 16 hours or more. So really useful, love sponge filters.
Yeah, I agree. Sponge filters are great, tons of benefits. Fish can eat off of them, baby fry and shrimp don't get sucked up in them, so great filter. My last tip is to embrace nature. There are a lot of different things that are happening in these aquariums. There are a lot of different organisms and things that are growing. And my advice is to embrace all of it, whether it's algae or snails or, little tiny animals that are swimming around that you can't identify. For the most part, they're all safe for the aquarium and they all have a benefit. So algae could be beneficial. Snails are extremely beneficial. Those little critters that you don't know how they showed up in your aquarium and are swimming around can also be beneficial in breaking down waste and also providing food sources for some of the smaller fish in your aquarium. So just know that your aquariums don't have to be like that perfect picturesque aquarium that you see like on Instagram or anything like that. Just know that it's natural to have fish that pass waste and have snails in there that consume that waste, to have little infusoria and small animals that are in there, detritus worms and algae growing in there that's also helping to break down the nitrate and things like that. So I think the more that we embrace nature, the more we learn from our aquariums, the better off we're going to be.
I love that because I think as a beginner, our tendency is to look at aquariums and be like, oh, it has to look perfect, like these crazy aquascapes that really only exist for one day, basically, when they shoot that picture, and then they add in all the equipment and all the, the stuff that you don't see behind the scenes. In reality, aquariums are supposed to be just kind of the slice of nature. So my final tip is, I know a lot of you are really excited about getting into the aquarium hobby. Once you kind of tackle your first aquarium, you just want to get another one and another one and another one. It becomes what we fondly refer to as multiple tank syndrome. I would ask that you consider taking a step back and seeing if, do you really get enjoyment out of all the aquariums that you have? Or are some of them kind of ones that for one reason or another, you're not really appreciating as much, you really don't spend a lot of time looking at it, and you're kind of feeling a little burnt out in the hobby because there's just so many water changes and tanks to maintenance. In that case, maybe consider consolidating and then reducing the number of tanks that you have to take care of. I know for me, I currently have 4 tanks. That's kind of the limit I've found for myself. But really, out of those 4 tanks, I probably stare at 2 of them the most. And then the other 2, you know, I still take care of them. I don't neglect them. I feed the fish, but I don't really get as much, you know, enjoyment. And I don't spend a ton of time just constantly looking at the fish, like what Zenzo was saying, constantly looking at the little ecosystem in those tanks. So in those cases, I might be considering what can I do to maybe refresh these tanks, maybe keep different fish in them, or maybe it's time for me to take them down, because in certain seasons, you're capable of taking care of more tanks, and other seasons, maybe less.
Yeah, that's great advice, Irene. Obviously, I suffer from multi-tank syndrome a little bit, but it's my job. If it weren't my job, then I would probably only have like 6 or so aquariums. So definitely
True.
enjoy your aquariums. Whether you have 20 or 2, it doesn't really matter, but just make sure that you enjoy them, and it doesn't really make sense to have a whole bunch of them if you can't care for them. So great advice.
If you're curious what our founder Corey's beginner tips are, then check out his top 5 things he tells people just getting started in the hobby.